coming through?
Yes.
Okay. Is it clear?
Great. All right, let's get started then. All right, everybody, good morning. We can do better than that. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning, David. Okay, so today is day 2 of our Staff Summer Institute. Yesterday was really fun. I had a great time hearing everyone's perspectives and meeting lots of new friends in our Europe, Wyoming community. So I'm super excited for a second day of innovation and skill sharing and development. So our first speaker today is the keynote, and it is supporting Wyoming's diverse student populations. And our speaker is Dr. David P. Rivera. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Rivera a few weeks ago to discuss this presentation and found out that he grew up in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and was a McNair scholar and was served by one of the McNair advisors who works in the office just down the hallway from me, Susan Stoddard. And we had a great time just talking about these student access programs like Gear Up, SSS, and other TRIO grants and McNair and how important they are to our students. And I was just so cheered to see someone from Wyoming working in such a successful role. So again, we've talked a lot about supporting our students' social, emotional learning and development and their mental health. And Celeste and I really wanted to have another really powerful perspective on how to support students from backgrounds that might not be as familiar to us. And so we've invited Dr. Rivera. Let me just quickly give his background. Dr. Rivera is an associate professor of counselor education at Queens College City University of New York, or CUNY, and founding director of CUNY's LGBTQ+ student leadership program. He received his doctorate in counseling psychology from Teachers College, Columbia University. He also holds degrees in psychology and counseling from Johns Hopkins University and the University of Wyoming. His professional experience includes college counseling, higher education administration, and consultations on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Dr. Rivera has worked at a variety of institutions, including the University of Pennsylvania, Georgetown University, Prince George's Community College, and Jack Kent Cooke Foundation. His research is guided by critical theories and social justice frameworks and explores cultural competency development and issues impacting the marginalization and well-being of students of color and oppressed sexual orientation and gender identity groups with a focus on microaggressions. He's published books, journal articles, and book chapters in various areas of multicultural psychology, education, and social justice. And his latest co-edited book, Affirming LGBTQ+ Students in Higher Education and Critical Theories for School-Based Practice, a Foundation for Equity and Inclusion in School Psychology and Counseling, will be released in late 2021. Dr. Rivera is advisor to the Steve Fund, faculty with the Council for Opportunity in Education, and holds leadership roles in the American Psychological Association. He has received multiple recognitions for his work from the American Psychological Association, the American College Counseling Association, and the American College Personnel Association. So I'm really excited to welcome such a pedigreed speaker like Dr. Rivera. And if I haven't missed anything, I'll go ahead and let him take it away. But first, let's go. Please join me in welcoming him with a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alex. And just another sound check. Am I coming through clearly?
Yes, I turned the volume up a little bit.
Yes.
So can you try again?
Okay, I'm going to try. Is this coming through clearly?
Are we all good?
Is it loud enough? Yes?
Yes.
We're good? Awesome, awesome. Well, thanks so much, Alex. And just a joy I wish I could be there in person with everybody in Wyoming, but it's a joy to be able to at least be with you all virtually. And I just am very humbled by the invitation to come and be a part of your Summer Institute and share a lot of my knowledge, but also my experiences being from Wyoming and navigating systems of higher education as a first generation low income going college student. And so the students that you're serving definitely are the profile of who I was growing up in Wyoming. And actually my little brother was a Garrett student, part of the LCCC Garrett program. And so college access and success programs, including Garrett and TRIO, are near and dear to my heart. And I recognize them as being a very significant component of my life's journey and the successes that I've been able to gain over the course of my life. And so I'm a psychologist, and so inevitably wellness is a large part of how I conceptualize the world around me and kind of a major function of what helps to what helps to motivate us, but also helps to promote us and propel us forward as we achieve our dreams and optimize our fullest potentials. And so what I'll talk about is the connection between wellness, academic success, and serving students from various types of marginalized or oppressed backgrounds. I'm going to start us out with a mindfulness moment. One thing that I've really leaned into very heavily during the pandemic, something I've been practicing beforehand, is mindfulness, and how mindfulness can be a very elegant and accessible remedy to the daily stresses that we are all enduring in our life. And right now, there aren't many assumptions that I make, but one assumption that I do make is that all of us, every single person in this world, is more than likely more stressed than they were, let's say, 2 years ago, right? As we are still continuing to live in this pandemic and deal with all of the aftermath and all of the things that keep on getting thrown towards us, I find that mindfulness can be a helpful solution in terms of helping to bring ourselves back to who we are. So if you all just bear with me, if you've not done mindfulness, maybe this is your first time, if you've done it in the past, fantastic, but this is a very brief guided mindfulness exercise that I'll walk us through. So begin by bringing your attention into your body. You can close your eyes if that's comfortable for you. You can notice your body seated wherever you're seated, feeling the weight of your body on the chair, on the floor. Take a few deep breaths. And as you take a deep breath, bring in more oxygen, enlivening the body. And as you exhale, have a sense of relaxing more deeply. You can notice your feet on the floor. Notice the sensations of your feet touching the floor. The weight and pressure, vibration, heat. You can notice your legs against the chair. Pressure, pulsing, heaviness, lightness. Notice your back against the chair. Bring your attention into your stomach area. If your stomach is tense or tight, let it soften. Take a breath. Notice your hands. Are your hands tense or tight? See if you can allow them to soften. Next, notice your arms. Feel any sensation in your arms. Let your shoulders be soft. Next, notice your neck and throat. Let them be soft. Relax. Soften your jaw. Let your face and facial muscles be soft. Then notice your whole body present. Take one more breath. Be aware of your whole body as best as you can. And then when you're ready, you can open your eyes. That's a very brief mindfulness meditation that focuses on being aware of the various muscle groups in your body, especially those muscle groups that tend to hold a lot of the tension that our body absorbs in the world around us, sometimes without our conscious awareness of that actually happening. I find that a brief mindfulness meditation like this can be helpful both by yourself in private. I often use this to start out my classes. I definitely use this to start out nearly all of the talks that I do. And what I find from the feedback from my students and those that participate, even those that may be skeptical of mindfulness or meditation, is that they actually do find that something that's guided, that is shorter, might be more accessible. It might be, and it's something that can help them nearly at any time, at any place. Just a little bit of the science behind mindfulness. There's this concept of neural integration. This is what's happening in our brains when we are fully rested, when we're taking care of ourselves like we should, when we're eating healthy, when we're getting plenty of movement into our lives. We find that we're actually able to think more clearly. We find that our fuse for anger or for upsetness is much larger, and so we actually have more time to kind of critically think about our decisions before reacting. But when we're overly stressed, what actually is happening in the brain is that those parts of the brain that should be communicating with each other so that we can do what we need to do to get through the day, so that we can produce those words that kind of give meaning to whomever we're talking to as our main mode of communication. And many times, but when we're overly stressed, those connections slow down. And when we experience significant trauma, sometimes those connections can be completely blocked. But what we find through the research that's being done on mindfulness is that mindfulness practices can actually remedy and combat that neural disintegration that's happening and actually promote more neural integration, right? And so if we connect this back to what students are going through, right? Students in general, going through their phases of life and adolescence, et cetera, are already going under a lot of undue pressures. But now we add the pandemic, we add sociocultural issues, we add issues of marginalization, et cetera. Their brains are even more overly stressed. And so the way this kind of fits in there is that if we can offer them these remedies to help them relax themselves, to help them become more neurally integrated, that's going to have not only an impact on how they understand themselves in the given moment, that's going to allow them to be more present, especially in those situations where you are preparing them to be very present in. So in the classroom, for example, they can easily incorporate a mindfulness exercise by themselves, even silently in the classroom, where if they're feeling stressed, that can help them bring themselves back to who they are, the given context, and they can be more present. And so mindfulness, I honestly believe it has a widespread effect and many benefits that can be very helpful. And if we can infuse this kind of framework of mindfulness and other coping mechanisms that I'll go over later into the lives of young people early on, it's only going to do them better, because as their brains are developing, they're actually internalizing that information much more easier than all of us on this call right now, unless you happen to be under the age of 22 when your brain is still kind of forming. Anyhow, that's my little spiel of mindfulness. It's something that I cannot preach or promote enough. The benefits of it are pretty fantastic. So again, my main area of expertise is in the world of cultural competency. So helping people to develop relationships and understandings that can help us communicate and be effective in working with people of nearly every walk of life, even if they present like somebody who may seem very different from who we are. If we approach cultural competency and maintain this kind of framework, it's going to help us to become better in terms of the kind of work that we do. So the cultural competency framework that I go off of is one that asks us to be aware of our own internal dynamics. So what are our assumptions? What are our values? What are our biases? And how might we make sense of those, right? Including how might they kind of impact how we work with other people. The next is kind of increasing our knowledge base. And so I'll be sharing a lot of concepts that will help us understand the experiences of not only the students that we work with, but the general world around us. And then skills, right? So it's good to have awareness and knowledge, but if we don't have skills, right? If we don't have a way of putting it into practice, then that awareness and knowledge is almost for naught in a way, right? And so I'm going to also talk about different strategies or interventions that you can use with your students that are also good for use with people, anyone that you come into contact, including your own family members who may share some cultural identities that you do, but often will have different cultural identities as well that kind of fit into their own areas. I like talking about culture in more detail. Oftentimes, I like this idea of an iceberg. Oftentimes when we think about and talk about culture, it's really only the surface level things that we focus on. And we kind of lose direction of the other aspects of culture and how it influences our day-to-day functioning. And so we can think about the surfacey level, so foods, customs, festivals, flags, the way that one might dress, the different holidays that one might honor, the languages that one might speak, how one might present themselves, right? So all more visible forms of culture, et cetera, things that we see may be promoted more in media, et cetera. But there are so many more areas of culture that are much more significant in terms of how somebody understands and makes sense of the world around them. And so our communication styles, there are different cultural differences for for folks in terms of just eye contact. We know in certain cultures that eye contact and direct eye contact with elders may be a form of disrespect, right? And so if we kind of put that in the context of our work and in the classroom, our young people will likely see us as elders, right? As somebody who is holding some kind of prestigious position in relation to who they are. And so if we notice that we're chatting with a student and they're not giving us direct eye contact, or maybe not even giving us a whole lot of verbalizations, it may not be because they don't care, but might be more so because of their cultural communication styles and how they're now trying to readjust those for speaking with people that may be outside of their cultures, right? Notions of friendships, for example, a family even. In many cultures, the notion of family isn't dictated by bloodlines, but more so by kinship, right? Who may be in the community around you. And so that might be important for us to understand in terms of if we're trying to incorporate family into the support system, we may need to think a bit more largely and more broadly beyond the family of origin or blood family or bloodlines, et cetera. Many indigenous people and cultures actually don't take blood as the significant kind of definition of who is a part of that tribe or a part of that kinship network, and more so based off of relationships and the relationships that have been built over time. Concepts of time, concepts of the past and the future and our relationship with it are all dictated on the cultures that we are all embedded in. And so in my family, for example, time is kind of loose. And I kind of grew up with, if we were saying something started at 1, maybe people will start arriving at noon. Maybe some people might not arrive until 4, right? But that was because the concept of time was much more loosely defined and loosely based. Attitudes, again, towards elders, we see many differences that in terms of how elders are treated and respected from culture to culture. Ideas about death, right? And existential kind of crises, relationships with the world around us and land, et cetera. I'm hoping that I'm making the point here, but that when we think about culture, let's kind of increase our awareness to think about it much more deeply than those kind of surfacey things that we come into contact on a regular basis. An activity that I recommend going through, especially as we're thinking about our own awareness, especially around identity groups that maybe we might not feel as comfortable with, maybe because we don't identify within those groups, or maybe we haven't done the introspective work in terms of trying to understand our own groups in a more nuanced way, is that there's kind of some questions that you can even just ask yourself, right? So for example, maybe let's think about language use, right? Thinking about the use of language in your homes and your cultures, which languages were spoken, right? For many of us, maybe English was the dominant language that was spoken, right? And so if that was the dominant language being spoken, we know that is the more privileged language, right? That's usually what we use in this country as a common way of communicating with each other, right? And so it's good even in our privileged identity groups to kind of consider, how did we understand that idea? So for language, for example, when was I first aware of English being my first language? When was I first aware of other languages being spoken by other people, right? I had a neighbor who was half Korean, half Caucasian, and the mom spoke Korean, and that was one of my first introductions, growing up in Cheyenne, which is very homogenous to another language. But I really did see then how that language served as both a barrier in some situations, but also as a strength in other situations in terms of how they navigated their family life, but also the community around them that tended to be predominantly Latino. I grew up on the south side of Cheyenne, so those of you that are familiar with that area, go to the kind of the cultural mix of that part of the town. But just thinking more deeply about how our first experiences with difference even manifested, and what were the messages behind that? Where did we get those messages from? Often we get them from our immediate surroundings growing up. So thinking about how our families of origin communicated messages about these various groups, thinking about how the communities that we were embedded in treated or conceptualized these various issues. So these are some questions that you can take with you to kind of do some introspective work around various identities, especially those that maybe you're not quite aware of, or maybe might not have an understanding for, even how your current ideas about various groups. If we think about sexual orientation or gender, where did those ideas come from? How did we come to grow into our own identities. So that kind of introspective work can be very helpful. I also take an ecological perspective when we think about these issues too. So far, I'm kind of talking about it from that individual level, right? How do I understand the world around me based off of my own process of being socialized and normed into my family, into my educational context, et cetera. But we have to think about it more broadly, right? And so this ecological perspective isn't my own. It's borrowed from Yuri Bronfenbrenner, who is in the world of developmental psychology and education, and really gave us this understanding for how we develop that. It's not usually based off of solely innate characteristics or strengths that we were born with, but a lot of it is predicated on how we were socialized into the environments that we navigate, right? And so we have to think about the various institutions that we navigate. So school tends to be a very common one for many people, right? That common educational experience with schooling starting as early for some people as 2-3 years old if they attend preschool, et cetera. But what is that environment doing, right? Someone's relationship with the healthcare system, right? Those early experiences that a young person has with their healthcare providers does have an impact on how they envision the healthcare environment. So if there were negative healthcare experiences early on, I did some research in health psychology with young people. That was actually my McNair Trio project when I was an undergraduate student. I watched one summer lots of little kids getting inoculations. And I kind of started to understand that for some children who were getting these inoculations, and when it was a bad experience, that then translated into them having negative connotations about getting medical treatment, maybe developing phobias with shots, et cetera, right? So just thinking about how someone's early experiences can have a very long-lasting impact on how they engage with various institutions. But then we think about the communities that we're embedded in, right? What are the resources in that community? What are the strengths of that community? What are the barriers or boundaries that community might have in terms of maybe not promoting access to various resources? Maybe it's geographic. We know in Wyoming, geography is a huge context. We know it's not easy to get from point A to point B often, right? And so we know that we take that into consideration as one of those contextual issues. We think about public policy, and not just the public policies that are actually passed, but even just the rhetoric behind public policies and how just the debates around them can have a significant influence on how people live. And so we don't even need to have a law passed, but if we have a lot of discussion around that law or that policy, that's going to have a very significant impact. And then the historical context, and that's one area that Yuri Bronfenbrenner really didn't include as forthrightly, but the historical context has a huge influence on how we understand where we are right now. And I'll go over some of these with some more examples as we go through to give us some context. And so thinking about the communities that we're in, and a lot of the social justice movements that have been persisting over time and that we saw a rise in last summer, have an impact on everyone wherever they're living. If we think about the water protectors, right, with the pipeline issues that we see kind of in our neck of the woods, in the Dakotas especially, and those, and again, that rhetoric, that debate, what the water keepers and protectors were doing to defend that land has a big impact on the indigenous folks that are living in Wyoming. Again, those communities are very, very connected. Even, this middle one is from one of the Mauna Kea in Hawaii, and so trying to protect that sacred space from overdevelopment as well. Again, indigenous folks on the mainland are still connected to that, and so still have an impact of that. We think about the debates of the southern border wall, right? And so we definitely know. I know that my own family in Wyoming, and I'm fourth generation, so my family moved from New Mexico in the early 1900s to Cheyenne, and so we have deep roots there. But we're still impacted by the debates of this border that the wall that was proposed and that was even started to have construction on the southern border. But what does that say for Latinx people with Mexican lineage, especially people that are still living in Mexico? If anybody's ever spent any time on any of the major American border cities or just on a border town, We can think about El Paso, for example, and the sibling town is Juarez over in Mexico. Those two towns share so much more culturally together than, let's say, that El Paso has with New York City, for example, right? And so significant impacts on people that are not just living in those areas, but they may have cultural ties to those areas. And so when we think about these issues as they're arising, and they're going to continue to arise, it's good to think about, even if they're not happening in our own immediate geographic location, how might my students or the people that I'm around, how might they be impacted by just hearing about it? Again, with the advent of media, I'm not sure if you're able to see, I'm holding up my phone. Just as we are on it often, young people are on it even more so often. And so they're extremely connected. And so those issues that maybe we might not think they're being impacted by because they're happening in some other location, they're still feeling the vicarious impacts of that. And as I get to talking about trauma, I'll talk about how vicarious trauma can have a just as impactful of a situation on somebody than direct experiences with oppression, etc. When we think about the impacts of social justice issues, of oppression, and of societal problems, we don't need to look any further than what the pandemic has kind of revealed. Pandemic really didn't create a lot of these inequities that we're seeing, such as people of color dying from COVID in higher rates compared to white folks, such as people of color and women having significant threats to employment because of the pandemic. People that are studying women in careers are definitely afraid of a lot of the setbacks that COVID may have caused to a lot of the strides that have been made in terms of women's rights and women's positionality in the workplace in terms of income earnings and just representation. And so we're seeing that was a previously existing problem, but whenever our country experiences a human or natural made disaster, we often see that it's the marginalized communities that bear the financial, the economic, the educational, and the employment fronts of those issues. And we're seeing that that's coming through in the pandemic with a lot of the research and the statistics that are being given. This is coming from the COVID tracking project that was tracking deaths from COVID, and they actually stopped doing this in March, and that's because the CDC and other agencies, state agencies, are just not collecting this data in a uniform way. So it's really hard to even put these numbers to make sense. But in March, these numbers were like this, and every week, this had been going on for like a year, these numbers looked the same, but they were just getting more and more desperate, where we were seeing more folks of color dying from COVID compared to other folks. Thinking about history again, Wyoming, we have indigenous reservations, and so for many of us, that knowledge of indigenous people in North America was very present for many of us in Wyoming because of our close proximity to indigenous folks. But it's really good to think about what was the real narrative for indigenous people in North America. The history books will probably never, or they don't usually include the term genocide, but that's really what happened to the original peoples of this country. Nearly 90% of them were killed during that initial stage of colonialism that was going on in the early settling of North America. Only around 7 million indigenous people have persisted to this very day, but they represent a wide variety of tribes, right? A wide variety of federally recognized reservations. And so there's so much within cultural differences that these tribes have. And also they share a lot as well. But it's good to think about just the vast diversity within even specific cultural groups. And it's all this, in this history is also why it's important that we acknowledge the lands that we're occupying, and to acknowledge the fact that unless you're indigenous, the fact is we're occupying lands that were stolen from them. And so I'm actually calling them from Georgia right now, which were the initial lands of the Cherokee and the Muskogee and other tribes. And so when I give talks, I also acknowledge where I'm calling from because I want to acknowledge this historical context. And I also mention that, in our fights for freedoms, our struggles for freedoms, as people of color, as women, as queer people, as poor people, as first-generation college-going people, in these struggles for freedom, that when we think about how freedom kind of manifests for Indigenous folks, they'll tell you true freedom is not going to be actualized until lands are rightfully restored and returned. And we know that the mechanics of that are probably just not realistic for anything in the near future. And so just kind of thinking about, even when we use terms like freedom, right, that freedom means something different to everybody, right? And I'm going to get to cultural humility later. And so when we talk about different terms, I might have a thought that this is something that's universal, but when I go and talk to an Indigenous friend or colleague, they're going to say, nope, my idea of freedom is totally different. And my journey for freedom is going to look a bit different, and maybe even a lot different than your journey for it. There's just another example of the historical context and the need to attend to it. Thinking about where we're launching our students into, or launching them into a campus context, right? So what do those campus contexts look like, right? Still predominantly, we're seeing lots of strides in terms of inclusion of students of color that are now matching more so demographics in the general society. It's not quite there for all groups yet. But when we look at the faculty, again, those who are charged with teaching, right, with demonstrating, with modeling careers, if you will, for these students, we find that number drops off a lot. And as somebody who identifies as Latinx, as Mexican American, I can tell you that it took at the University of Wyoming, where I had an amazing experience. I didn't notice that I had any Latinx professors in psychology until nearly the end of my tenure there as an undergraduate student. And as I kind of process and think back to what were those messages that were being covertly sent to me, and how did I internalize them, I do know that had an impact on me. I later learned via developmental psychology and how we kind of learned that we really do learn off of finding mirrors that kind of match us in various ways and mimicking them. As human beings, we are primarily imitative learners. We copy things, right? That's how we are able to learn quickly. That's how we're able to transmit a language and culture very quickly, is because we just imitate it. Whereas other species of animals are more emulative learners, where they learn to create a new use from an object that will likely differ from maybe how another member of that species might operate that object. But anyhow, that concept kind of helps explain maybe the experience of a young person who, let's say, is majoring in accounting, right? Let's say this is an Indigenous student who wants to become an accountant. They go to college, they're excited, but they don't have any Indigenous instructors, right? So what message is that covertly and maybe overtly sending to them about their positionality in that career, right? Unless it's overtly spoken about, they might walk away with thinking that maybe there is no room for me here, or maybe there's only room for me at the lower rungs of positionality in this career, right? I know that I took some time off in between my degrees, and part of it I think was because of the immense career discerning that I was going through, that was complicated by my earlier experiences where I didn't see people that look like me in the profession. Again, it wasn't until much later where I was able to find those communities of folks that look like me, that sound like me, that shared various identities, such as even being first-gen or low income. That was a very important professional community that I joined, especially as a professor, where that's not the typical experience. So we think about where we're sending our young people into, so that we can help to prepare them for kind of entering into those dynamics and those areas with some tools and with some understanding, or maybe why they might be experiencing what they're experiencing, if they're feeling maybe like they're not included, or they're not experiencing strong senses of belonging, et cetera. Maybe it's because of those messages that they're getting from those contexts that they're navigating. And one of the main ways that bias is demonstrated and that young people are telling us that they're experiencing are via microaggressions. One thing that I am kind of happy about in terms of the microaggression research, I started studying microaggressions in the mid-2000s, before it was kind of a mainstream concept. You know, I can watch a sitcom now on NBC, and microaggressions will be inevitably kind of spoken about, where the term is actually used. That wasn't the case 15 years ago. And so I know as somebody who was introduced to it by my mentor, that when my mentor taught me what microaggressions were as a graduate student who was 30 years old, right, who had this lived experience, kind of overnight, I was able to put a word and a framework to a lot of experiences that I had that I wasn't able to make sense of, that spanned to childhood to my current day. And so young people now have this as part of their rubric, their conceptualization for how they understand and deal with the world around them, which is fantastic. But what we now have to do is kind of give young people the tools for how to then navigate these microaggressive situations. So for those of us that may not be as familiar with what they are, they're brief, they're commonplace interactions. Oftentimes they're spoken about in terms of the verbalizations that people use. And I'll go over some examples, but they can be behaviorally dictated, maybe how somebody kind of crosses their arms or maybe steps away or avoids being around somebody because of maybe presumed danger or criminality. But they can also be embedded in the environments that we navigate. And I think some of those are the more insidious forms, because you don't need somebody to trigger them for you. All you need to be is in an environment where there are environmental microaggressions present. For someone with ability issues, let's say somebody who has mobility ability issues, that can look like being on a campus, and there are many in New York that are not ADA compliant because they're historical buildings where it's not easy for them to get from point A to point B because maybe there are stairs there, right? Or maybe the elevator that's present is not accessible or conveniently located, where they have to then take another 15 minutes or a half hour to kind of find that route or what have you. So that's a significant environmental microaggression for folks that are mobility limited. So one example, but it can happen to anybody who experiences an identity that has some form of oppression or marginalization attached to it. So thinking of English language learners having to navigate environments, again, where English is predominantly taught and spoken and used as the main conduit of communication. As they're still learning, they're going to have some struggles with kind of understanding fully what's going on. And so they're only going to be getting, a portion of the message as they're kind of going along their journey of English language mastery. But also thinking about the various other issues that an English language learner might be going through, such as the additional responsibilities that they may be responsible for in their families. Maybe their parents are not proficient in English, and so maybe they're doing language brokering, right? Where they're having to be the interpreter for their parents with everything their parents have to do, maybe from even getting a job to paying bills to even being the interpreter between a lawyer and the parent, right? So being privy to a lot of even stressors because of that process that maybe somebody who wasn't brokering that language wouldn't be privy to. So anyhow, lots of issues can kind of stem from microaggressions and the context that microaggressions kind of put into place. Environmental microaggressions that I mentioned, again, you don't need somebody to trigger them. And so the demographics aren't really matching. So no one here looks like me, sounds like me, maybe culturally like me. I might feel lonely. And this was my experience in some of the educational environments that I navigated. Content in the curriculum. So for studying American history, it doesn't include the history of folks of color or the narrative of indigenous genocide like it really was done, then that is, again, sending a message that your history is not important enough to include, or your history is not important enough for us to lie about. And those are the messages that we walk away with. Cultural student programming, I love cultural months, but if we're only celebrating or acknowledging students that say, I use Hispanic Heritage Month, which actually spans 2 months. It's September 15th through October 15th. And so my joke is I like to claim both months. But if we are only celebrating people for a week or a month, what happens to the other 11 months that they're there and that they're a part of that, and that's a part of that community? Okay, I'm going to go through a little quickly. I'm looking at my time. The detrimental impacts are pretty large. It's the research on microaggressions find that it spans nearly every form of psychopathology that one can have. It not only creates the acute emotional reaction of dealing with it, but microaggressions that are not process as they happen will accumulate. And so the theory of microaggression states that it's not just one microaggression that's going to lead to any of these things happen. It's the accumulation of microaggressions over the course of one's days, one's weeks, one's months, one's years, that when they are not adequately processed, will then lead to some of the chronic health problems that research is revealing, including physical health problems, right? So we're not just seeing it mentally, but we're seeing cortisol levels kind of shoot up, and an over influx of cortisol in the system can cause a whole host of other issues, physical health wise. So you see substance abuse there. We're also finding that folks that endure microaggressions and other stressors, again, just typical with trauma, substance is used as a way of not feeling like you're feeling, right? It's used as a mechanism of escape, but it's a maladaptive mechanism. So what else can happen? We don't want them to disengage from educational environments, but if students are experiencing these in their educational environments, again, without it being explained, again, we're not going to be able to remove a lot of these things from our students' environments, but if we can teach them about them, we can help prepare them for what they're about to enter into, so that they're not kind of taken off guard or surprised, right? We can just say that this is probably going to happen. If it doesn't happen, fantastic. But I just want to arm you with some knowledge and then some skills for how you might navigate this, right? So that they don't disengage. I did that my first year. I went to hardly any classes because of the intense difference I was feeling as a Latinx person, as someone who was first generation going to school, someone who was very poor, and also someone who was in the closeted phase of being gay. So dealing with a lot of those issues, kind of, and not understanding that others around me were also dealing with them because they were actually holding them to themselves. There were plenty of other low-income folks on campus. There were plenty of other first-gen folks. There were other Latinx folks, less than, but because folks weren't talking about it, I didn't know they existed. And that was before I was attached to TRIO. And so I felt very, very lonely. And that had a negative impact on my academic self-concept. I started to think, well, maybe college isn't for me. I had a very weakened social support network. Social support is one of the best ways to deal with adversity in one's life. I developed stereotype threat, imposter phenomenon, and I'll talk about a bit more about what that means. So what happens when these microaggressions are not attended to, when we don't see students for who they fully are and attend and value and affirm their various identities, what that does is that leads people to then internalize those negative messages that we're hearing. Just think about any negative message you've heard in your life. If you were ever told that you weren't good at something, right? Maybe you weren't good at sports, or maybe you weren't good at throwing a football. Maybe you weren't good at cooking. Maybe you weren't good at math or reading. Maybe you have that message. Where'd you hear that from? It's often that we heard it from somebody, maybe multiple times, or it may just be that we heard it from somebody that we honored or respected a lot, such as a teacher. Now, I was told that I wasn't a good reader early on in first grade. I came into kindergarten. I went to Head Start, and I went to a good Head Start program. I actually learned to read before I went, but it was because of my last name. When I realized it was all the other Latino kids that were being put into this remedial reading class, I didn't know what was going on. I now know what was going on, but that had a severe impact on even how I kind of conceptualize my reading competency. Like, I know that I have extreme proficiency, but those messages still have an impact on who I am today because they were not processed early on in life. And so the manifestations are things like stereotype threat, which is this idea that, again, the stereotypes are so supported via various contexts that we navigate, by the media especially, that we are inevitably going to internalize them. And even if we consciously don't believe in that, so I consciously believe myself to be an intelligent person, but I still have some of these threats of being a weaker reader and even being weaker in math, where I've taken graduate level, doctoral level math, and obviously doctoral level, I've done doctoral level reading. So I know I have the evidence that says I know that's not true, but because those early experiences were so strong and they seeped in so deeply, that threat is still there. So just being reminded of one's threatened group can lead them to actually perform in that stereotyped way. But what we know is that when we teach young people about this phenomenon of stereotype threat, it actually can mitigate the impact of it on their academic performance. So just again, that's knowledge can be saving. Imposter phenomenon, all of us, all of you in this room probably have, not probably, I just know it to be true. It's a very common phenomenon. We have that voice that kind of critiques us often. Some of us have it louder than others. People that are coming from oppressed groups are not only going to have the general imposterism that just anybody has because of esteem issues or what have you, but are going to have the added imposter phenomenons based off of those negative stereotypes that we have been inundated with from birth to our current present moment in life. So that can be like the one that tells me, David, you're not really an expert in oppression. You're not really an expert in this. No one's really going to want to listen to you talk. You're not going to be able to communicate it appropriately. I still have that voice in my head, but I know it's an imposter voice. And so the simple remedy for that is calling it out when you hear it. But the only way that I'm going to be able to do that is if I know what it is. So again, teaching young people about the existence of this. And I've been doing this a lot with, especially with younger groups that I work with. I teach them and I help them process this because I know that just knowing about the knowledge and the language and having a term to make sense of one's experience can be healing in and of itself. Again, we can't remove it. We can't change the systems overnight, but we can help our young people kind of mitigate it by giving them the knowledge. Some things, again, persistence is what we want to see happening. Again, we want to see our young people being able to make it through unfamiliar systems and cultural experiences as they get launched out there into maybe different geographic areas to go to college, or maybe even to go to a new job or what have you. But navigating unfamiliar systems can actually disrupt it if we're not armed with the knowledge for maybe what to expect once we're in that unfamiliar system. Having multiple responsibilities, that the youth that we're working with, if you're poor, there are often going to be financial responsibilities that you take on early in life. I know I did when I was a teenager. My first job wasn't about me making money so I can go buy the next a gaming console. No, it was for me to contribute so that we can have lights on in the house, so that we can have heat in the winter, etc. Language brokering for ELL learners, having then to manage that with my own workload, my own school, my own family positionality, having sociocultural identity mismatch. And what that might look like is someone like me who I knew I was gay from an early age. I didn't come out until my early 20s, but I also grew up extremely religious, Roman Catholic. And so there were definite mismatches between what the church was telling me about being gay and who I knew myself to be, that had a delay on me actually coming to terms with my identity and coming out and being proud about who I am and acknowledging the strengths that come along with it. But when we have those identity mismatches, that can actually have a disruption on our persistence and our motivations to persist throughout life. And then the exposure to microaggressions that are inevitable. Some things that we can do, again, one framework that has really infiltrated psychotherapy is this concept of cultural humility. And I truly believe it's something that everyone should think about and should think about adopting as a way of being. So this isn't really a skill per se, but it's more of a presence that you have. So it's the ability to maintain an interpersonal stance that is other oriented, right? So not thinking of, so when I'm communicating with somebody, where's my mind? Am I automatically thinking about how am I going to reply to what I'm hearing? That's often what we do. That's why our conversations can move at a rapid pace, because not only are we taking in the information from the person that we're communicating with, but at some point we often don't stop listening fully. We're still listening, but we start to form a response. When we start doing that, that means that we're not fully attending to what this person is telling us, and we're now putting our frame onto what that person is sharing with us. And so cultural humility asks us to slow down that process, to really engage with whomever we're talking to, and to believe and honor that whoever we're talking to is the expert in their self and the expert in terms of how they understand whatever they're talking about. It may or may not gel with or meld with how I understand it, but for me to build understanding, I have to set that aside and understand, well, how does this other person understand it, right? And so thinking about being culturally humble, that means checking our own biases, checking our own ideas for various concepts in life, and really valuing what the person we're working with is sharing. And one way of doing this, I say start with the basics, and I have basics in quotes. And so I think about my experience as a therapist, for example. if I sit down with a client and I usually will start off with, so what brings you in here today? Something very, very gentle, something very, very common. Can people hear me right now? I heard that the sound went out online.
We can hear you in the live room still.
Okay, are folks, are other
It might just be a problem on Taylor's end.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So Taylor, would you mind reconnecting? I think she was having problems yesterday too, but not to call her out.
Oh no, well, that's all good. Well, so thinking about again, those first moments that we meet with somebody, and sometimes we'll take for granted that, so as a therapist, if I take for granted that my client has the same understanding of what wellness means, which they probably don't, but if I take that as an assumption, I'm going to be very misdirected, right, in terms of how I'm going to understand whatever wellness concerns that they tell me. And so I like having these basic conversations to start out with. So with a student, so I'm advising, I work in a graduate program, so I advise grad students. And so I start off even with them, I tell them, so what is the purpose of you being in this program? What does education mean to you, right? What are you going to do with these skills that you're learning, right? What is the purpose of being here? So thinking about some of those basic questions, I don't even think they're basic, that's why I have basics in quotes, can actually open up the conversation much more widely and can help give us direction in terms of where we're going to intervene, right? Based off of what the young person is telling us or whoever we're talking to. Again, we can use cultural humility in every context. You can use it with your loved ones even, right? And it will actually help you to understand them much better and will likely have them even feel that you're even more affirming and respectful of what they have to offer in any given situation. But I find that sometimes we skip over these because we think of them as of universals when they're really not universal. Education means something different to everybody. And so I would want to know at the beginning of a relationship, what is their understanding of it so that I know what our starting point should look like. Yeah, I see that Taylor is now on. Fantastic. In terms of engaging with culture, right? We're talking a lot about it. It needs to be engaged with throughout the entire process. So even those initial meetings, I might even ask somebody, so tell me how your various experiences in your life are having an influence on your education, right? So I do it in a softer, more general way, because I do know that some words, like if I say culture, that might have sometimes a negative influence on somebody. Eventually, I'm going to want them to talk about it, but I can talk about it in ways that make me round it out initially to get them to a point where they are talking about it, but maybe in not the ways that might create barriers, but actually might bring up understanding. So asking, so maybe how is your family influencing your educational process? That's a really easy way to talk about culture without actually having to use the word culture. Tell us how your friend group is influencing your educational life, right? That's another way. I think that's another important sphere of their cultural experience. Being aware of your power. So just knowing that coming into this relationship, anyone that you're working with that is a student in the program is automatically going to see you in a hierarchical position of power, inevitably. Doesn't matter how casual you are, how you maybe even dress it, maybe down a little bit more to kind of fit in a bit more with the younger person, they're still going to have that. And so it's our job then to be aware of it and to understand when power might be interfering in a negative way, right? Is it causing a barrier? Is this power differential maybe precluding the young person from coming to me for support, for help, for direction? Being intentional about our language use, setting precedents early on for talking about race and culture, right? And I even explain, I say, because of these experiences of oppression and marginalization, because of what we see and what the research says about college students' experiences with their college environments or even K through 12 environments, we know that there may be experiences where maybe you might not feel welcome. Maybe you might not feel like you belong. And I want you to know that may be more common than not, but there are things that maybe you can do to mitigate it. So maybe thinking about intentionally building social support networks in school, knowing that that's something that is going to inevitably help me, not only in terms of what a young person might think of their social support network being good for, having fun and partying, et cetera, but no, they're going to be the ones that you're going to turn to when you encounter a struggle, when you might need additional support or help, and that's a significant part of your daily upkeep. And knowing our limits as well, knowing when we may need to seek out more help, we may need to seek out more development in terms of our understandings of these various phenomenon and how they're impacting our students. Again, with combating imposter phenomenon, I can't talk more about this because it is so widespread. Everybody has it, regardless if it's coming from a culturally dictated place or just our experiences with folks around us. But again, calling it what it is when it's happening. Literally saying this is imposter phenomenon. Like I literally will say that out loud if I'm alone. And that's a really good way of understanding what that voice is and putting it in its place, right? Quieting it down some. Maximizing our strengths, and we can't do that enough. So really asking your students to verbally and in written form write down, what are you good at? What if people told you you're good at? Do you believe it? And if they don't believe it, that means that we're gonna have to emphasize that more in their life, right? We're gonna have to be the ones that help to infuse that sense of belief into them so that when they leave, our care, they will know that, I actually am good at these things. These are my strengths. I can name them. If you can't name your strengths, you're not going to be able to know how to put them into action. We can share rubrics. What I'm going to actually do is share a resource packet with Alex after this that gives you some, so for dealing with microaggressions, there's actually a toolkit I'm going to share that not only talks about what somebody who's experiencing them can do when they experience them, but somebody who might experience one happening might be a bystander, right? So maybe you notice, maybe you're witnessing it happening between two people. So then what can you do to kind of step in and help to mitigate the process so that communication can be restored as much as possible, so that learning can actually occur from the situation, as opposed to just sitting there with the hurt feelings that often result from microaggressions, especially those that are unprocessed. So I'll present more. I'll share this this framework and more of a resource with Alex, and that can be distributed hopefully in the handouts. Thinking about persistence, and this comes from non-cognitive variables of understanding ourselves, but understanding, again, it's not just growth mindset, which is really huge, or having an optimistic explanatory style when we deal with or encounter adversity, but thinking about a young person's ability to understand how oppression manifests in their life, how that can be an important tool in building academic persistence. Them understanding themselves as sociocultural beings, so understanding their identities can be very important, again, in them developing a positive self-concept, right? All right, so I am going to pause here. Again, there's some other things I'm going to share here, but I'm going to give them as a resource. I didn't leave much time for questions, but is there a question or two that I can, that is looming out there? I wasn't able to monitor the chat as much, but has anything come through, or is there anything on anyone's mind?
Maybe we could do one question from the virtual audience and one question from the live audience, and we'll have some time after lunch if everyone sticks around to have more conversations about this. So let's start with the virtual audience. Does someone want to ask a question?
I have a question.
Okay, we'll do the live question first from Christy Russell. Can you hear her?
Hi, David.
Yes, I can hear her. Hi.
Great. I'll use my teacher voice. So,
Yes,
as a low-income Wyoming student, how did you decide to go to college? And if you could explain the supports you had personally, and then also kind of discuss, because we're all working with Europe, so we're all working with lower income students. What supports we need to provide our students, from your perspective and your research?
That's a great question. And I will say that, I wasn't a part of a college access or success program until, again, I was a junior in college, sophomore, junior in college, when I entered McNair. However, I feel like I had my own Europe going on for me via the people in my life outside of my family. Like my family, the education messages were positive, but there wasn't that strong expectation to go to college. It was like, if you do it, that's fantastic. If you don't, that's also fantastic. But I was very religious. And so I had literally the Catholic nuns at one point gave me an upward bound application, right? And so having folks like that were very important. That's exactly what you all are doing, are providing those kinds of supports that are necessary to kind of adjunct what the family can provide and what might be limited there based off of, again, the limited knowledge, not having the experience of going to college. And so those were really important, having those folks that were, and they were critical teachers at all stages of life who saw something in me and that directed me towards a program or nominated me for something. But I really think that maximizing the community resources and supports. And so I know that that's what you all do. You all know that that's significantly important, especially in rural areas, is how do we connect to these supports, right? Connecting with the family. I think that could be really important. I think it would have been really helpful if my mom kind of had her own orientation, right? Not the one that the college gets, right? But one that is more suited for a parent of somebody who was first generation low income, right? What would those expectations be like? Because I didn't have those tools. I didn't have that language. I didn't have the language that you all have to explain that to her. And so what that resulted with me is often frustration. And then what that led to is just me leading two lives. So I did a lot of code switching. So I would teach them about code switching as well, how that can be an adaptive coping response where you might be acting one way at college, but then when you go home, because your family might not have that understanding, and honestly, it could be fatiguing having to explain things over and over again, that I just stopped talking about it. I just let them believe that everything was fine when things were not fine. My first year was horrible, but they didn't know that I wasn't going to class. I told them that, oh, Trey, I love what I'm doing. I didn't want to scare them. But had I even had permission from someone to say that maybe you should share this with your family, right? It's important for them to know this, but also having an orientation for them that was focused on what the experiences are specific to low-income first-gen students and parents would have been helpful for my mom and would have been helpful for me and the community in general. But what motivated me was, again, knowing that I had that support and that base, and I did have those positive messages that were directed towards me, and that did help to open up the world, where it did encourage me to actually leave Wyoming to pursue a graduate education and other career opportunities. Now, I want talent to stay in Wyoming, and I want to give back as much as possible. I love the youth that you're saying there to kind of stay there to help Wyoming kind of revitalize it and grow and what have you. But also I think I've been using this word permission. And I use that purposefully because as somebody who's multiply marginalized, we often have to ask for a lot of things. We just get accustomed to it. And so sometimes we need to be given permission in various ways to break some of the norms that maybe we have developed for ourselves that might actually be limiting us or serving as boundaries. So I hope that helped in some kind of way.
Thank you.